It was a rainy Monday morning when Frank Harper stepped into the luxurious Carson Motors showroom, the most prestigious car dealership in the city. At 72 years old, Frank wasn't dressed like their usual clientele. He wore a weathered gray trench coat and scuffed shoes. His thick, unruly white hair and slightly hunched posture made him appear unassuming. The showroom sparkled with elegance. Gleaming marble floors, chandeliers, and rows of luxury cars lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. Frank had been eyeing a sleek black car through the glass for weeks. A brand new Zenith GT, a masterpiece of automotive engineering. It wasn't just a car to him. It was a dream, a reward for a lifetime of hard work. As he walked inside, the receptionist barely glanced at him before returning to her phone. Frank stood awkwardly near the entrance, taking in the grandeur of the place. It didn't take long before two young salesmen, dressed in sharp suits, noticed him. "Look at this guy," one whispered, barely suppressing a smirk. "Think he's lost? Maybe he's looking for the bus station," the other chuckled. Frank pretended not to hear them and approached the desk. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly. "I'm interested in the Zenith GT. Could I speak to a salesperson?" The receptionist raised an eyebrow, scanning him from head to toe. "That car starts at $250,000, she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "I'm aware," Frank replied patiently. "I'll get someone," she said, her expression a mix of disbelief and amusement. She gestured to the two salesmen who had been snickering moments earlier. The taller of the two, Jake, strode over with an exaggerated grin. "Good morning, sir. Interested in the Zenith GT, you said?" "Yes," Frank replied, his voice calm but firm. Jake shot a glance at his colleague, Tim, who was struggling to contain his laughter. "Right this way, sir," Jake said, leading Frank toward the car. As they approached the sleek vehicle, Jake couldn't resist making a jab. "You know, this car isn't just a showpiece. It requires a certain lifestyle to maintain." Frank ignored the comment, running his hand along the polished hood. "It's beautiful," he said. "What's the process to buy it?" Jake blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Well, typically we discuss financing options, but," he trailed off, clearly assuming Frank couldn't afford it. "I'd like to pay in full," Frank said simply. Jake's facade cracked for a moment before he burst into laughter. "Oh, that's rich. Pay in full? Sir, no offense, but maybe we should start with something more attainable." Tim joined them, unable to stay away from the spectacle. "Maybe the pre-owned section is a better fit," he said, grinning. Frank's expression didn't change. "I said I want the Zenith GT. Are you going to help me or not?" Jake leaned in slightly, his voice mockingly sweet. "Look, old man, we've got real buyers to deal with. Why don't you take a brochure and come back when you're ready to talk seriously?" Frank's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked out of the showroom, the laughter of the salesman echoing behind him. The following morning, the employees of Carson Motors arrived to find an unfamiliar sight. A convoy of luxury black SUVs parked outside. Men in tailored suits, accompanied by security personnel, were already inside the showroom, poring over documents. Jake and Tim exchanged nervous glances as they entered. "What's going on?" Jake asked the receptionist. Before she could respond, a commanding voice boomed from the back office. "Everyone, gather around." The staff assembled near the center of the showroom, where a tall, impeccably dressed man stood. His expression was serious, and his presence exuded authority. "My name is Mr. Collins," he announced. "As of this morning, Carson Motors is under new ownership." A murmur swept through the crowd. Jake whispered to Tim, "What the hell? I didn't hear anything about a sale." Before they could speculate further, the glass doors swung open, and Frank Harper walked in. This time, he wasn't wearing his trench coat. Instead, he was dressed in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, his posture straight and his expression commanding. Jake's jaw dropped. "No way." Tim looked equally stunned. Frank strode to the center of the room, standing next to Mr. Collins. "Good morning, everyone," Frank began, his voice steady. "As Mr. Collins mentioned, I'm the new owner of Carson Motors." The silence was deafening. "I've spent my entire life building businesses," Frank continued. "I started with nothing and worked harder than anyone else I know. Yesterday, I came here as a customer, but I was met with disrespect and ridicule. That's not the kind of culture I want in my company." Jake and Tim exchanged panicked glances, their faces pale. Frank's gaze landed squarely on them. "You two," he said, his tone sharp. You made it very clear that you don't value all customers equally. That ends today. Sir, we didn't mean, Jake started, but Frank held up a hand to silence him. You're fired, Frank said firmly. Both of you. Clear out your desks immediately. The rest of the staff stood in stunned silence as the two salesmen stumbled over their words, trying to plead their case. Frank turned back to the group. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Treat every customer with respect, no matter how they look or what you assume about them, because you never know who's walking through that door. As Jake and Tim were escorted out, Frank glanced at the Zenith GT parked in the showroom. And someone please get me the keys to that car, he added with a small smile. As Jake and Tim stumbled out of Carson Motors, Frank Harper stood tall, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. The employees who remained shifted uncomfortably, whispering amongst themselves, unsure of what the day would bring. Frank wasn't done. The humiliation he had endured yesterday wasn't something he would let go lightly. Now, Frank began, his tone calm but charged with authority. I'd like to hear from the rest of you. How many of you witnessed what happened yesterday? The staff froze. No one dared to speak, but Frank's piercing eyes settled on the receptionist. She fidgeted with the hem of her blouse, her lips parting hesitantly. I saw it, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded slowly. And what did you do? I didn't think it was my place to intervene, she stammered. Frank's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. Not your place? Let me tell you what your place is. It's ensuring every person who walks through that door feels valued. That's not just good business. That's decency. The receptionist's cheeks flushed crimson, but Frank wasn't interested in further embarrassing her. Instead, he turned to the rest of the group. This dealership isn't just a building filled with expensive cars. It's a reflection of the people who work here. And right now, it's a mess. A culture of arrogance and disrespect has festered under the surface, and I won't tolerate it. So here's what's going to happen. Frank gestured toward Mr. Collins, who stepped forward with a stack of envelopes. Each of you will receive a notice, Frank continued. Some of you will stay. Others will not. The employees gasped. Whispers erupted as Mr. Collins began handing out envelopes. Frank's decision to conduct immediate performance reviews was a shocking display of authority, but he wasn't finished raising the stakes. As the staff opened their envelopes, their expressions ranged from relief to despair. Some were informed they were being retained but would undergo rigorous retraining. Others were dismissed on the spot, with security escorting them out. Frank watched the process impassively until a commotion erupted at the back of the room. One of the senior managers, a man named Victor, stormed forward, his face red with indignation. This is outrageous, Victor barked. You can't just waltz in here and upend everything. I've been running this place for 15 years. Frank's expression didn't waver. And in those 15 years, you allowed a toxic culture to thrive, he said coldly. Victor's fists clenched. You don't know the first thing about running a dealership. You're right, Frank admitted. I don't. But I know how to run a business, and I know how to treat people with respect. Something you seem to have forgotten, Victor sneered. You're just some rich old man playing God. This place doesn't need you. Frank stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And yet, here I am. Let me make something clear, Victor. Your reign is over. Pack your things. You're done. Victor sputtered, his bravado crumbling. Security moved in, and within minutes he was gone. The atmosphere in the showroom was tense as Frank addressed the remaining employees. I'm not here to destroy this business, he said. I'm here to rebuild it. And those of you who are willing to change, who are willing to work with integrity, will have my full support. Suddenly, the doors to the showroom burst open, and a small group of journalists entered, cameras flashing. Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. The journalists were from the local news station, drawn by rumors of the dramatic upheaval. Mr. Harper, one reporter called out, can you explain why you bought Carson Motors? Frank stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. Yesterday, I came here as a customer and was treated with disrespect. Today, I'm here as the owner to ensure that no one else experiences the same treatment. The reporter pressed on. Some might say you're being overly harsh with the staff. What would you say to that? Frank's eyes gleamed. I'd say it's time for accountability. Respect isn't optional, it's mandatory. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that clear. Just as Frank was finishing his impromptu press conference, a sleek black car pulled up outside. A middle-aged woman stepped out, her sharp heels clicking against the pavement as she entered the showroom. "Dad!" she called out, her voice laced with disbelief. Frank turned, his stern expression softening into a smile. Rebecca Harper, Frank's estranged daughter, was a renowned corporate strategist. She hadn't spoken to her father in years, but the news of his bold takeover had reached her. "I couldn't believe it when I heard," she said, her eyes scanning the room. This is incredible," Frank chuckled. "It's just the beginning." Rebecca smiled, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "Maybe it's time we talked about working together." Frank nodded, the weight of the past slowly lifting. Together, they would rebuild Carson Motors not just as a business but as a beacon of respect and integrity. The old man had not only reclaimed his dignity but also rediscovered the power of family. And this time he wasn't doing it alone. Frank's heart warmed at Rebecca's words, though he hid his emotion behind a small, knowing smile. The two hadn't seen eye to eye for years, their relationship strained by misunderstandings and time. Yet, here she was, extending an olive branch in the most unexpected way. Rebecca glanced around the room, her sharp mind already analyzing the situation. "I can see why you did what you did," she said, motioning toward the subdued employees still clutching their envelopes. "This place needs a complete overhaul. Systems, culture, everything." Frank crossed his arms, his tone cautious but hopeful. "I've got ideas, but you've always been the strategist. If you're serious about working together, I'd welcome your input." She raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You've never been one to take advice easily." Frank laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed through the tense room. "Age has a way of teaching you things. Let's say I'm ready to listen." Rebecca smirked. "Good. Then let's get to work." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Rebecca and Frank dove into the dealership's operations, uncovering layers of inefficiency, corruption, and neglect. They worked long hours, often butting heads over decisions, but their shared determination kept them moving forward. Frank focused on the human side of the business, meeting with employees individually to understand their strengths and weaknesses. He rehired some of those who had been let go, offering them a chance to prove themselves under new leadership. Others, who had been complicit in the toxic culture, were permanently replaced. Rebecca, meanwhile, modernized the dealership's operations, introducing streamlined processes and launching a marketing campaign to rebrand Carson Motors. She emphasized transparency, quality service, and community engagement, a stark contrast to its former reputation. After months of relentless effort, the day of the grand reopening arrived. The once-stale showroom was now vibrant and inviting, its walls adorned with photos of happy customers and employees. A large banner outside read, "Welcome to the new Carson Motors, where respect drives us forward." The event drew a large crowd, including journalists, curious locals, and even former customers who had sworn off the dealership. Frank and Rebecca stood at the entrance, greeting guests with warm smiles. As the ceremony began, Frank stepped onto a small stage, microphone in hand. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "A few months ago, I walked into this dealership as a stranger and left feeling humiliated. That experience taught me a valuable lesson, not just about this business, but about myself. Respect is not something you demand. It's something you earn. And today, we're here to show you that Carson Motors has earned it." The crowd erupted in applause. Rebecca joined him on stage, taking the microphone. "This isn't just about selling cars," she said. "It's about building trust, creating opportunities, and giving back to the community. We're not just turning a business around. We're setting a new standard." As the event wound down, Frank spotted a familiar figure lingering at the edge of the crowd. It was Tim, the former salesman who had been fired on the first day of Frank's ownership. Tim approached hesitantly, his usual arrogance replaced by humility. "Mr. Harper," he began, his voice shaky. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you, and for everything else." Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted. But what are you really here for, Tim?" Tim sighed. "I heard about the changes you've made, and I realize now how wrong I was. I'd like a second chance. I'm willing to start at the bottom if that's what it takes." Frank considered the plea. He glanced at Rebecca, who gave a subtle nod. "All right," Frank said. "One chance. But don't waste it." Tim's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I won't." Under Frank and Rebecca's leadership, Carson Motors became a model business, celebrated not just for its success but for its values. Employees flourished in the positive environment, and customers returned, drawn by the dealership's reputation for fairness and integrity. Frank often walked the showroom floor, chatting with employees and customers alike, his presence a reminder of the power of perseverance and redemption. And Rebecca? She found more than just a business partner in her father. She rediscovered a bond she thought was lost forever. Together, they proved that even in the face of humiliation and adversity, it's never too late to start over and to succeed. Success, Frank often said, isn't measured by what you gain but by what you give back. And Carson Motors was living proof of that truth. Frank stood at the dealership's front door, watching the vibrant crowd as the grand reopening reached its peak. The dealership gleamed under the sunlight, a beacon of hope and transformation. His heart swelled with pride as Rebecca, now the confident co-leader of their renewed enterprise, mingled effortlessly with guests. A voice called out to him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Rebecca, smiling warmly. "Dad, come here. Everyone's asking for you." Frank began walking toward her, the weight of their journey lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt complete. His family healed, his life's purpose fulfilled. But as he stepped forward, his vision blurred. The laughter around him became muffled, the vivid colors of the showroom dimming into shadows. He reached out for Rebecca, but she faded like mist slipping through his fingers. Then came the darkness. Frank jolted awake, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of his modest apartment. The air was cold, the room silent except for the faint ticking of an old wall clock. He sat up on the worn-out sofa where he'd fallen asleep, still clutching the creased flyer from Carson Motors. His trembling hands smoothed the paper, the bold letters advertising luxury cars for discerning buyers staring back at him. The dealership had been real, but everything else, his bold takeover, Rebecca's return, their triumphant success, had been nothing more than a dream. His eyes wandered to the small table beside him, where a single photo rested in a cracked frame. It was Rebecca, much younger, her bright smile a painful reminder of the years lost to pride and misunderstandings. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. A bitter laugh escaped his lips, the weight of reality crashing down on him. "Just a dream," he muttered, his voice hollow. "That's all it ever was." Frank rose from the sofa, his legs unsteady beneath him. He stared out the window at the flickering neon sign of the diner across the street, the world outside moving on without him. The dream lingered in his mind, vivid and cruel. It had felt so real, the pride of rebuilding the dealership, the joy of reconciling with Rebecca, the sense of purpose he thought he'd found. But dreams, he realized, could be both a torment and a gift. He looked back at the flyer in his hand, its edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. His grip tightened. "Maybe it's time to stop dreaming," he whispered to himself, "and start doing." With a deep breath, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Frank didn't know if he could ever make the dream a reality, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of determination. Because even if the dream was only in his mind, it had shown him what could be. And sometimes that was enough to start again. What would you do if you were in Frank's shoes? Would you fight to turn your dreams into reality, or let the weight of the past hold you back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this story and want more inspiring and emotional tales like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and join our community. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.